Morning. I'll remind you that you're still under oath. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Terry. Go ahead, Mr. Escobar.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Proctor.
Good morning, sir.
Mr. Proctor, you remember we left off with your last statement where you told this jury that you had probable cause based on a totality of circumstances to arrest Mr. Reeves. Remember that?
Yes, sir. Something to that effect. Yes, sir.
Okay. And so you would agree with me that that process requires the application of facts that you have learned in the investigation
Yes, sir.
from witnesses and from the evidence,
That's correct.
and applying the law in this case.
Yes, sir.
And so what is the law on justifiable use of deadly force, Mr. Proctor?
Judge, I'm going to object from the president.
Yes.
Now, Detective, from the very beginning, you weren't supposed to be assigned to this case, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, it was Detective Soto that was supposed to initially be assigned to this case,
Yes, sir.
and he was on the other end of the county,
That's correct.
and because of the time that it was going to take in order for Detective Soto to come, you were assigned to this case, correct?
That is correct, sir.
And you would agree, would you not, Detective, that you were only assigned as a homicide detective in one prior case dealing with self-defense
That's correct, sir.
prior to the Mr. Reeves's investigation?
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you would agree as well that you had never taken a course dealing with the issue of self-defense and homicide?
Not a formal course, no, sir.
And you were really only somewhat familiar with the law of self-defense?
Yes, sir, that would be correct.
Now, Detective Aaron Smith was going to be the crime scene detective, is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And the crime scene detective is in charge of the crime scene.
That's correct.
That's a very important function, is it not?
Yes, sir.
And the reason that it's an important function is because in our system of justice, when you're out there, you're supposed to preserve all of the evidence, correct?
That is correct.
You're supposed to preserve the evidence for the prosecution, correct?
Yes, sir.
You're supposed to preserve the evidence for the defense,
That is correct.
and you're supposed to preserve the evidence for the community.
Yes, sir.
Because when an incident like this is investigated, you don't call the public defender's office and say, hey, come on over and join us so that we can likewise investigate the case, right?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And you certainly don't call a private attorney like me, right?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, Detective Aaron Smith was quite new in the homicide section of major crimes, correct?
That is correct, sir.
In fact, maybe weeks or days before, he was a detective investigating missing persons.
I believe he had been in that unit a month, 2 months in the unit.
Okay. But before that, he was investigating missing persons.
Yes, sir, which is was under the umbrella of major crime.
Okay. And so when he came into that particular unit, he was going to be shadowing you.
He had shadowed me, yes, sir.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
So if it was a month, he was shadowing you for a month.
Yes, sir.
And you knew, did you not, that Detective Smith had not even been to the homicide investigative course by that time?
I'm not aware if he had been or not, sir.
Now, when you first got there, and I'm going to give you a pad to make it easy. May I approach your honor?
That's fine, sir. I have my own pen.
You've got your pen? Okay. Just because if you need to jot down some notes, that'd be good. What time did you get there to the Cobb Theater?
According to my notes, sir, I arrived on scene at 2:15.
At 2:15, and what is that in military time?
14:15.
14:15. Okay, why don't you jot that down if we can?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so you get there to the Cobb Theater scene. You don't know yet whether you're going to be assigned the case or not, correct?
That's correct.
And so you're kind of waiting around.
I see every single one is wasting.
I'm very sorry. Someone sent me a video. I'm very sorry.
You were waiting around.
Waiting around.
Yeah, you got there. You didn't know if you were going to be assigned yet. It took some time for that decision to be made.
Not really, sir. I met Acting Sergeant Harris and Major Corbin. As I was getting out of my vehicle, I saw them standing there. I pulled up next to them. We got out and we were talking. about the incident.
Okay, and were you talking about the fact that Soto was on the other end of the county?
That's what I believe Sergeant Harris told me.
Okay, and so at some point in time in that conversation, a decision was made to assign you to this case?
That's correct.
Okay, and so, do you know what time that was?
I do my first interview with Alan Hamilton at 14:27.
Okay, so let's jot that down. 14:27 is your first contact with Alan Hamilton, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and so you didn't do anything between the time you arrived and your first contact with Alan Hamilton, other than speaking to the sergeant?
I received a briefing from them as to what had occurred,
The sergeant?
and Major Corbin.
Okay, and so by this time you realized it, and where were you when that conversation took place?
With Harris and Corbin
Yes, sir.
in the parking lot.
You were in the parking lot. Is that where a command center had been set up?
Not at that time, sir, no.
Okay, well, did a command center get set up?
I don't remember, sir, that. I don't remember. I think they might have had a mobile command center there as I was leaving. I'm not for sure.
As you were leaving for the day?
Yes, sir. I was in and out, and that's one of the things I was not paying attention to.
Okay. So, certainly, you knew that there was a large force of police officers, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you knew the minute that you were assigned this case that it was now your responsibility to make sure that this case was investigated
Yes, sir.
properly.
Yes, sir.
And you had the awesome responsibility of making sure that the evidence was going to be preserved, that witnesses were going to be adequately interviewed, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that those interviews were going to be properly memorialized.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so, let me ask you a question. Before going to your first interview, which was a mere, 12 seconds after you arrived? Excuse me, 12 minutes after you arrived? You arrived at 14:15, Alan Hamilton, 14:27. I'm not great in math, that's why I became a lawyer.
12 minutes, yes, sir.
12 minutes, okay. And so, within 12 minutes from you arriving, you are now going to be interviewing Alan Hamilton, and that took place where?
In the theater, I believe it was in the party room.
Okay, so you had to have some time, since you were talking in the parking lot with the sergeant, there was some walking time to get over to that theater, correct?
Just a couple of minutes, yes, sir.
Okay. And then get in there and sit down.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, in order to do that, you had to walk through the lobby.
That's correct.
And you, as you walked through the lobby, you could see a bunch of people, patrons, lay people, congregating, correct?
The lobby was, they had a lot of people in the lobby.
And those people were not police officers, these were lay people, patrons of the theater.
There was some law enforcement in that group.
Okay, but the majority was lay people, right? Witnesses.
There were a lot of people, sir. There again, I didn't get a count on them or anything, but there were a lot of people in that lobby.
In those 12 minutes, did you go to the officers that were there in the lobby and tell them, hey, officers, this can't be. We got to separate these witnesses? Did you tell them that?
I know, sir.
Did you tell those officers, hey, officers, please, you need to tell these individuals not to talk to each other?
No, sir, I didn't tell him that.
You are quite familiar, are you not, with the issue of contamination, correct? Witness contamination.
Yes, sir, I am.
In fact, that was taught to you as early as your time in the academy, when you first became a police officer, right?
Yes, sir.
And what they taught you was clearly that you've got to separate witnesses. Because if you don't, the information that's exchanged contaminates, right?
Yes, sir.
And not only does it contaminate, it may be wrong, correct?
That's correct.
And not only can it be wrong, but the person that's hearing it actually believes themselves that they own it now. Correct?
That could be, yes, sir.
In fact, they start believing it and actually think that they're seeing it.
Objection, speculation.
Sustain.
So, in order to get to Theater 11, is that where you were?
No, sir.
What theater did you interview Mr. Hamilton?
In the party room.
Party room, and where's that at?
It's right inside the entrance
To the right or left?
to the right.
To the right. Okay, and so in order to get into that party room, you can see Theater 10, right? You can see the Theater 10 sign?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you knew at the time that you were assigned this case that the incident had occurred in Theater 10.
That's correct.
And you passed Theater 10 and you didn't go into Theater 10.
No, sir.
Well, you knew that there were officers in Theater 10, correct?
Yes, sir.
You weren't going to do anything to contaminate the scene if you had gone into Theater 10, right?
That's correct, sir.
You knew the incident had occurred there, right?
Yes, sir.
You didn't know what evidence existed or didn't exist in Theater 10.
At that particular time, no, sir, I did not. I knew there was a popcorn and a cell phone.
Oh, so before you went into the party room, you're telling me and this jury that you knew that there was popcorn and a cell phone where?
On the aisle.
On the aisle. Did you know the measurements of that aisle?
No, sir, I do not.
Did you know the measurements of the seat?
No, sir.
Did you know the measurements from seat 9 to the seat right in front of row 9?
No, sir.
Did you know at that point in time what the lighting conditions were at the time the previews were playing?
Other than it was being dark, no, sir.
Did you know what previews were playing and how loud they were?
No, sir, I did not.
Now, previous to this particular incident, it had been at least a year before you had been to the theater itself, and I'm talking about the complex, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And in fact, you don't even remember, as you were there, you don't even remember that you had ever been in Theater 10.
Sir, I remember going into one of the theaters. I don't remember which theater number it was, but I remember being at that complex, and I thought it to be Theater 10 with the bistro.
You remember, page 52, Devo, lines 16 through 18. Do you remember?
Judge, I'd ask for the date.
My apologies, Judge. I should have said the date. March 27th, 2015. You would agree, you remember the depot that you and I had on that date, correct?
I remember giving you a depot, yes, sir.
Okay, and you remember being placed under oath?
I do.
And you remember me asking you a series of questions
Yes, sir.
about this incident?
Yes, sir.
And you would think certainly that your mind was clearer, or certainly you had a better recollection of the events back in 2015 rather than 2022.
Yes, sir.
You remember the following questions. Have you ever been in Theater 10? Answer. I've been to the Cobb Theater. I don't remember what theater I've been in. Were you telling the truth back in 2015 when I asked you that question?
I've never read that depot, even though at the end of the deposition I asked to read before it was published,
Uh-huh.
and I've never had the opportunity to read that deposition.
Did you call the court reporter as you were supposed to?
Judge, object. Can we approach?
Yes.
Now, so you go into this party room, correct?
That's correct.
And Detective Smith, was he there already?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Okay, and so he was going to go into the crime scene.
That's correct.
However, you don't know, at least you didn't know in 2013, whether Detective Smith had ever been assigned as the lead crime scene detective in a homicide.
That's correct, sir.
So I'm sure that that caused you to at least think, I've got to be careful. Because if he's never been assigned as the lead detective to a crime scene, he may need some guidance. Right?
Sergeant Harris was there.
Well,
Yeah.
did you tell Sergeant Harris, please make sure that you go and speak to Detective Smith to make sure that he's got a real handle on this?
This crime scene was relatively, it was an in-depth crime scene, for lack of a better purpose,
How did you know? You weren't in there.
because I had been told that of the evidence inside. There was popcorn on the floor, there was a cell phone, a spent casing, those kinds of things, but it was not an in-depth crime scene. I had complete confidence in Detective Smith. I had complete confidence in my team to process the scene correctly. They had been trained in that. They knew their job, and I had complete confidence in them. I did not go into the theater to see those items on the floor before I did my interviews.
Okay. So now, before going in to do this interview with Corporal Hamilton, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Corporal at the time.
Yes, sir.
You knew nothing about Curtis Reeves, correct?
I knew that he was an ex-Tampa police officer,
That's it.
that he was an older gentleman, and that he had been detained for shooting Mr. Oulson.
You certainly didn't know about any extensive training that he may have had as an officer with the Tampa Police Department.
No, sir.
And you certainly didn't know that at one point in time he was the commander, actually, he started the SWAT team at TPD, right?
No, sir. He told me that. Well, he didn't tell me about starting the SWAT team in the with Tampa, but he told me that during his interview.
Well, no, that's further down. We're talking right now, right before you go into that little room to interview Corporal Hamilton. You didn't know anything concerning his extensive training that he had.
There again, sir. He had just shot a man. It didn't matter if he was law enforcement. If it didn't matter who he was. He had just shot somebody, and at that time, that did not weigh on me as far as needing that information. I wanted to gather everything that I could to present to the court, and at that time, I did not feel I didn't feel the need to go into his background.
Okay, well, we're going to get into that in just a little while. And so now you go into this room with Corporal Hamilton, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and what you told the jury during direct examination is that you go into this room and Corporal Hamilton was supposed to be an eyewitness, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and you knew he was a police officer, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And so you go into this particular room with Corporal Hamilton, and you decide that you're going to talk to him about this incident, but you're not going to turn on your tape.
At the start of the interview, that's correct, sir.
Well, it was about, what, you spoke to him about 5 minutes off tape?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so for 5 minutes, you're talking to him about this particular incident, and you told the ladies and gentlemen of the jury yesterday that you did that because you wanted to know what he was going to say.
I wanted to know if he was going to be able to communicate it to me in such a way that I would be able to understand it.
Well, who cares? You turn the tape on, you let him communicate whatever he wants to communicate, and now we
Judge, I
know.
object, he's being argumentative with the witness.
I'm not being argumentative.
Overruled.
Detective, you turn on the tape recorder.
Yes,
You get it from the very beginning. If he's not making sense, then we know that maybe he's excited about what happened or he's concerned about what happened, but we get all of his words, right? There's nothing wrong with that.
Yes, sir.
You would agree with that. You want to get sometimes, many times, the emotions of the individual, correct?
At times, yes, sir.
And the uncertainties of individuals, correct?
Yes, sir.
Or sometimes the precise information from the individual, correct?
Precise information, yes, sir.
And so that's all captured by a recording.
Yes, sir.
And if you don't record all that, it goes out the window. Right?
Yes, sir.
And your responsibility in this case was not only to the prosecution, but your responsibility in this case was to preserve everything for this community and for the defense.
That's correct.
And you chose not to do that. Now, what you did was you got some kind of checklist. I believe you told the jury yesterday that you just jotted down what he said, and then you were just going to go down that list, right? That's what you did.
It's not a checklist. I was taking notes as to what he told me.
And then you, in that interview that's recorded, you just go down and ask those questions that he already answered.
That's correct.
But you don't know how he answered them, what his emotions were, what his recollection really was, nothing.
The tape stands for itself, sir.
Well, that's the tape after the first 5 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Now, let me ask you this question. Did you have in front of you, before you started that interview, did you have a voluntary statement form that he had filled out, signed, and dated? I believe it's on page 2 of your report.
Yes, sir, I do.
And you had it in that room, correct?
Yes, sir, I believe I did.
And so you were aware, you read it, right?
I did.
Okay, and so you were aware that Mr. Hamilton had indicated that Mr. Oulson was coming over the back of his seat, yelling at Mr. Reeves.
If I could review the written
Oh,
statement.
absolutely. Your Honor, may I approach? I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit Number 21.
So your question, could you reword or do the question for me again, sir?
Absolutely. So you were aware when you read that statement, right? Let me have it back, and I want to do it verbatim so that we don't have any mistakes. You were aware that I observed a white male stand up to my right, lean over the back of his seat, and begin to yell something to the effect.
Yes.
the voluntary statement that you had,
Yes, sir.
what were you aware of at that point from Mr. Hamilton?
That he had witnessed the shooting.
Well, and what had he witnessed? I'll put that in front of you so you can refresh your recollection if you need to.
We're going to object. This is hearsay. Mr. Hamilton already testified. Just going through the previous testimony with the different witnesses inappropriate.
You can refresh his memory with it, but
Yeah. So what, you can look down if you like.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so what did you know?
That he was at the Cobb Theater, that the movie had began. He observed a white male.
Your Honor, I think we're...
yeah. All right. I'm going to overrule.
Go ahead.
He stood up, the white male stood up, and according to the statement, he leaned over the back of the seat and began to yell something. I'm trying to text my fucking daughter, if you don't mind.
Okay.
And then he observed him throw
Your Honor, I
a,
think...
Okay, okay.
Oh, but I can have it move more if you want.
No, that
Okay.
was
Okay.
what we talked about in that.
Okay, so you had that before you even started questioning Corporal Hamilton, correct?
yes, sir, I believe so.
And you would agree with me, may I approach you on?
You may.
You would agree with me that Defense Exhibit number 21, take a look at it, is written very neatly. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so, I think that on direct examination yesterday, you acknowledged that, hey, we really should be turning these recorders on from the very beginning, right?
Yes, sir. It did not, however, change his statement.
Okay. Now, you interviewed Corporal Hamilton with his wife present.
No, sir, I did not.
So his wife was not present when you interviewed Corporal Hamilton.
That is correct.
You're telling this jury then that the only time that Corporal Hamilton and his wife were present is when you were interviewing her.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, your interview of Corporal Hamilton was 5 minutes off tape, correct?
About that, yes, sir.
And 6 minutes on tape.
About that, yes, sir.
Okay, so let's put down now, we've got the time that you came in, 14:50, the time that you started Hamilton's interview, 14:27,
Yes, sir.
and the time that you ended that interview, which was
2:38, 14:38.
14:38. Okay, 2:38.
Yes, sir.
Now, after that particular interview, you go to interview the wife, is that correct, Mrs. Hamilton?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and did you interview her in that same room?
I did.
And you still had not bothered to go back into the crime scene to, or not even back, you hadn't gone, period, to the crime scene to go see anything in there?
That's correct.
Okay. And when you interviewed her, you likewise started that interview without turning the tape on.
Yes, sir.
And your reason for doing that was because of what?
I wanted to make sure that she could communicate in such a way that I could understand it.
Well, you would agree again with me that if you had that tape on from the very beginning, we would know possibly her emotional state.
Yes, sir.
We would know whether she was sure or not
Yes,
of
sir.
what she was telling you,
Yes, sir.
whether she was undecided about certain events,
Yes, sir.
and we weren't able to capture that because it wasn't recorded.
That's correct, sir.
Okay, and so after that initial interview, how long was that initial non-recorded interview?
Uh, 2:43 is when I started.
And you left the other one at 14:38, so at best 5 minutes if my math calculations are correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So 5 minutes possibly off tape and on tape.
I've got it here that it was, the taped interview was from 14:52 to 14:57.
14:52.
Yeah, 2:52 to 2:57.
Okay. So now, you get her statement in the same manner that you got the recorded statement, in the same manner that you got Mr. Hamilton's, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you had jotted down your notes, and then you go through those notes, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, clearly, in this particular interview, you had Corporal Hamilton there, listening to what his wife was saying.
Yes, sir.
And you agree with me, that violates protocol at the Pasco Sheriff's Office, right?
Yes, sir, possibly.
Okay. Now, when you went to go get Miss Hamilton in order to do this interview, where was she?
Out in the lobby, I believe.
And was she out in the lobby with a group of patrons that had gone to the theater to view the theater?
I'm sorry, sir?
Yeah, out in the lobby, the
Right.
concession area. Was she in that group of individuals that had been in the theater during the time of this incident?
There again, sir, she was out in the lobby. I don't recall where she was at. She was near that party room. I remember there being windows, I believe, around that party room. And I sat looking out the window, and I did my interviews with them facing the wall, is how I recall it, sir.
But my question is in the lobby area. She was in the lobby area with those people.
Yes, sir.
And that's where you all went to retrieve her.
That's right. That's correct.
And you certainly, when you went to retrieve her, you didn't hear any police officers warning those individuals not to talk to each other.
No, sir.
And you certainly didn't give any instructions to officers to do just that.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. Now, since you took notes of both Corporal Hamilton and Mrs. Hamilton, you took notes there in that party room, correct?
Yes, sir, I did.
You don't have those notes because you shredded them.
That's correct.
It wouldn't have been difficult for you to just attach them as a piece of evidence, right?
That's not procedure protocol. These are my notes.
So you want to follow procedure protocol concerning the destruction of the notes, but you don't care about following procedure protocol when you're interviewing individuals together.
Sir, it's been a few years since I've read that procedure, but the thing that you do not want to do is interview two witnesses together without having at least one of those individuals interviewed. In this particular case, like I explained yesterday to the court, I had interviewed Mr. Hamilton. I had obtained information that I felt I needed at that time. I had saw his wife. She was upset. I wanted to get the very best statement that I could from her. Mr. Hamilton knew not to say anything during the interview. He simply sat behind her with me facing her and him behind his wife at a different table.
Did you put all that in your notes, Detective, that you shredded?
No, sir.
Okay. So now you're done with both interviews.
Yes, correct.
And the one thing that you knew, that there was yelling and curse words that were being directed from Mr. Oulson to Mr. Reeves, correct?
Yes.
Leaning over the back of the chair.
That's correct, yes, sir.
And so you would agree that that is an indication to you that Mr. Oulson was aggressive.
Objection, Judge. Can you approach?
Yes?
Sorry, Detective, I know that. I do it constantly here on my table.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
like, my funny bone is ready to pop out.
I can understand, yes, sir.
Okay. So, Detective, that's aggressive, right?
I guess it's in the way you would perceive it. We hear cussing and yelling all the time. That could be considered, I guess, aggressive if you wanted to term it that way.
And especially when you're leaning over the back of your chair and you're within, what, a foot, 2 foot of Mr. Reeves? That's aggressive.
There again, sir, that would be, it could be considered to be aggressive.
And you would agree, would you not, that when you're loud towards someone else, it has an impact on that person?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
It's 7:01.
What does that mean?
Approach.
The evidence. Detective, you would agree that at that point in time, you had this information from Corporal Hamilton and Angela Hamilton. At that point in time, you didn't know the distance between Mr. Oulson and Mr. Reeves while he was being aggressive, right? You didn't know what the distance was.
No, sir. I did not know the measurements.
And you didn't ask Corporal Hamilton, can you tell me, was it a foot? Was it 2 feet that you were seeing? You didn't ask that of Corporal Hamilton.
No, sir, I did not.
And that last interview with Angela Hamilton on tape was 5 minutes.
That's correct, sir.
Okay, so let's. What time did you end with Angela Hamilton? Let's go there. Started at 14:43, ended at 14:57.
That's correct.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong. You arrived at 14:15. You started
Objection, Judge. Asked and answered.
trying to get the timeline, Your Honor.
All right, I'm going to overrule.
I'll let you tell us. You got there at
At,
14:15. When did you first start Alan Hamilton?
227.
So 1427. And you ended with Alan Hamilton?
At 1438.
At 1438. You started with Angela Hamilton, 1443, correct? That's why I gave you the pad so we could,
Thank you, sir. I forgot.
okay.
I'm not accustomed to doing it this way. At 1443, 243, and I concluded that at 257.
1457, correct?
Yes, sir.
Military time.
Oh, we're going to use military. 1457, sir.
Okay. Now, from there, you do what?
I got a hold of Detective Koenig, and we went out and interviewed Mr. Reeves.
Okay, so you left the party room,
Yes,
right?
sir.
You didn't go into Theater 10, which was a crime scene.
That's correct.
And so how did you get to the location where Mr. Reeves was at? Did you go through another theater? Did you go all the way around the building?
We walked to the back of the theater and entered the parking lot. I had obtained my vehicle, and that's where we did the interview, was in my vehicle in the
So
parking
you
lot.
went out to the parking lot, got in your vehicle, and drove it around to the back.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, your purpose of doing this now was you wanted to interview Mr. Reeves.
That's correct.
And we've been fortunate enough to hear the interview of Mr. Reeves yesterday in this case, and you were present, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, certainly, when you first got to the point of interviewing Mr. Reeves, you now had this information, this voluntary statement that Corporal Hamilton had given to you concerning the aggression that he had witnessed, correct?
Objection to the characterization of the question.
He testified it was aggressive.
Overruled.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you certainly were interested, were you not, in what effect that aggression would have had on Mr. Reeves?
Yes, sir.
Because your job at that point was to assess whether or not Mr. Reeves's evaluation of the circumstances was reasonable, right?
Your Honor, I'm going to object.
Approach.
So now, you were going to interview Mr. Reeves, not only with yourself, but you were going to interview Mr. Reeves with another detective present. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in this particular interview that you had with Mr. Reeves, you didn't have a pre-interview non-recorded, right?
That's correct.
You applied a different procedure for Mr. Reeves in this particular case. You recorded from the very beginning.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, that was done in the front seat of your car.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And is there a reason that it was done in the front seat of your car and not in the party room as the other witnesses?
Convenience. He was handcuffed, detained. I didn't want to parade him back into the theater.
Well, you brought him into Theater 11 shortly after your interview, right?
Yes, sir, but we pulled as close as I could to that door to allow him to exit the vehicle to get into the Theater 11.
And that wasn't difficult.
Sir?
That wasn't difficult.
I ran over a curb, so I was able to get up to it, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, your interview of Mr. Reeves. You turned on the recorder, right?
Yes, sir.
And you started asking him questions, correct?
Yes, sir.
And we heard that Mr. Reeves told you that he was scared of Mr. Oulson, correct?
Yes, sir. The tape, yes, sir.
Okay, so let's talk about that. When you first started your interview of Mr. Reeves, you didn't even know the age of Mr. Oulson, correct?
I knew that he was in his 40s.
Well, that's because Mr. Reeves told you. I'm saying before the interview of Mr. Reeves, you didn't know Mr. Oulson's age.
There again, sir, I believe that I might have been furnished that information as to the fact that he was in his 40s by Major Corbin and Detective Harris. I knew that he was not a older man, the victim. I now recall that they told me that he was a middle-aged man and might even have told me that he was in his 40s.
And did you know how tall he was?
No, sir.
And did you know how much he weighed?
No, sir.
Okay. And so you start interviewing Mr. Reeves. That interview of Mr. Reeves takes about 30 minutes, correct?
Goes on at 15:10, 3:10, and
Stops at 3:40?
Let me just double check.
I've got it here if you need it.
I've got it here. That's right, 3:40.
Okay, so about 30 minutes, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You indicated to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury that you already knew, supposedly, that there was a phone in front of seat 9 in the theater, correct?
Yes, sir.
But you didn't know that seat 9 was the seat that Mr. Reeves was seated at, correct?
At the time that I'm interviewing Mr. Reeves,
Yes, sir.
I knew that he was on the back row. I knew that his wife was immediately to the right. I knew that Mr. Hamilton and his wife were 4 or 5 seats over to the left, and that the victim and his wife were in front of him.
4 or 5 seats? You think the Hamiltons were 4 or 5 seats to the left? What
That-
about 7 to 9 seats to the left?
7 to 9. At the time that I did the interview,
Yeah.
I wasn't aware. I knew there were witnesses on that row.
Well, you just said that you were aware that the Hamiltons were, I think you said 5 to 6 seats. It's really 7 to 9, right?
Those seats that the Hamiltons are in are not numbered on this map that I have. During my interview with them, they told me that they were 4 or 5 seats over to the left.
To the left. Okay.
According to Mr. Hamilton, he was to the north. The shooter was to the north of him, which would have been to the left.
And I'm sure that Mr. Hamilton told you as well that he was only able to see a silhouette because of the darkness in there.
I don't remember if that's the terminology that he used, but he did tell me that it was dark.
And that he couldn't actually see any facial features of Mr. Oulson because it was dark.
Are you telling me that's who said? Do that again, Counselor, please.
Alan Hamilton.
Yes, sir.
Now,
Hold on. Could you redo that question? I'm not for
Sure,
sure.
sure.
Okay.
Alan Hamilton told you that it was so dark that he couldn't see the facial features of Mr. Oulson.
Your Honor, I'm going to object.
Sustained,
There's
sustained. Move on.
Now, you knew, however, when you were interviewing Mr. Reeves, that there was a phone on the floor, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you know whose phone it was?
No, sir.
Or did you ask anybody? By this time, I would imagine you had Detective Smith already in the crime scene, right?
Yes, sir.
Or did you ask Detective Smith, hey, can you tell me what seat that phone is in front of? Did you ask him that? Smith?
No, sir.
So you didn't know who the phone belonged to, and you didn't know what seat it was in front of.
No, sir.
But you knew that it was in the back row, which we call row A, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you realized that it was somewhere in the center of that row. Or did you even know that?
I knew that it was in the center of that row, around
Okay.
the center of that row. Yes, sir.
And Mr. Reeves tells you that Mr. Oulson hit him in the head, either with a fist or a phone.
Or something. Yes, sir.
A fist or a phone or something.
Yes, sir.
And so that must have triggered immediately a ringing of the bell. Wow. Mr. Reeves is saying he was hit with a phone.
Your Honor, I object to the gratuitous comments being made by counsel.
All right, overruled.
That rang a bell, right? Because you knew that there was a phone there in that row.
Yes, sir.
And if Mr. Reeves is telling you that, hey, I think I may have been hit with either a fist or a phone, that phone becomes paramount in this investigation, right?
It's important. Yes, sir.
Very important. Would you agree?
It's important, sir. Yes, sir.
Is it not very important?
Everything is important, sir.
But this is really important, right?
It's important.
And the reason that it is important is because there may be some evidence, some physical evidence on that phone, right?
Yes, sir.
And that physical evidence could link that phone, or at least the DNA on that phone, to Mr. Reeves. Right?
Yes, sir.
And if in fact it does, now you've got a piece of evidence to try to recreate what happened, right?
Yes, sir.
Because that's what you're trying to do in these investigations. You're trying to recreate what actually happened in that theater, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, Mr. Reeves also tells you in that interview, not only that he was hit with a phone, but he tells you that that phone was in between his legs immediately after the shot. He realized, oh, there's the phone right between my legs after the shot took place, right?
Yes, sir.
And clearly you knew that because Alan Hamilton was the person that told you that the phone was on the floor,
That's correct, sir.
in between Mr. Reeves' legs.
Yes, sir.
And Reeves told you that it was a dark theater.
Yes, sir.
And you would agree the darker the theater, the more it affects people's ability to see.
Objection, speculation.
That's a 701.
Overruled.
You would agree the darker the theater, the more it affects people being able to see, right?
Yes, sir.
He also told you that it was extremely loud in that theater because of the previews, correct?
I don't know if he uses that terminology. He says that it was loud.
Okay, and you didn't doubt that, right? Previews are loud.
They can be, yes, sir.
And had you known by this time what the previews were?
I know, sir.
You didn't know that there were Action, RoboCop, Terminator?
Objection, facts not in evidence.
I'm asking him if he knew.
Oh, overruled.
Did you know?
No, sir.
You hadn't asked anyone there in management with the theater, hey, listen, tell me what the lighting settings were during the previews and what those previews were.
No, sir.
In fact, you never did that, did you? In your entire investigation there at the scene that night, you never even did that.
No, sir.
Now, when you realized that there was that phone on the floor, did you contact Detective Smith and say, hey, we've got to be very, very careful with that phone. We got to make sure we preserve it for DNA evidence because Mr. Reeves just told me that he thinks he may have been hit with that phone. Did you tell Detective Smith, who was the crime scene detective, to do that?
No, sir. That was part of his training, forensic techs, his training on how to handle possible DNA evidence.
So you left it to him that you didn't know whether he had ever been assigned as a crime scene detective on a case.
He had been assigned as a crime scene detective on a case, probably not on a homicide. However, he knew the proper procedure for handling DNA evidence.
How do you know?
He's very sharp. He knows how to work a scene. I've been with him before. He knows his job.
So grabbing the phone off the floor and turning it off the day of the incident and then coming back a few days later and taking the phone from the evidence room and turning it off.
Object, there's been no evidence of that.
Sustained.
Mr. Reeves told you that in addition to being hit on the phone with the phone, that Mr. Oulson was cursing violently at him, right?
I don't know if he uses the terminology violently, but he was cursing.
And that certainly was being corroborated by your previous interview of Corporal Hamilton.
Yes, sir.
Did you ask Mr. Reeves, how close was Mr. Oulson to you when he was leaning over that chair and yelling profanities?
No, sir.
You didn't ask him that?
No, sir.
I think you already testified that you didn't ask Mr. Reeves in that interview what his training was in identifying danger. Correct?
No, sir, I did not. But as I've previously testified, he could have been an ex-police officer, but in this particular case, that had no bearing on this investigation.
So you're telling this jury then that his prior training, no matter how extensive, had no bearing in this case?
Sir, as I testified yesterday, we are all human and we all have the capability of making mistakes.
No, but listen to my question. You just told this jury that his prior training and expertise has absolutely no place in a case like this. That's what you just told the jury.
During my investigation, it had no bearing in my investigation.
And so you didn't consider it.
I did not.
Now, Mr. Reeves told you that he was so frightened that he was trying to create distance by leaning sideways and back on his chair, correct?
I recall him telling me that he leans back in his chair.
And that was to create distance, correct?
That's correct.
You've been a police officer long enough to know that that's one of the skills when someone's about to attack you that you want to do, correct?
Your Honor, I object. 402.
Oh,
Correct? It's one of the things that you're supposed to do. That is a technique, create distance.
In some situations, yes, sir, you want to do that.
You certainly don't want to get closer to the person that's about to attack you. That's a big no-no, right?
There again, sir, it depends on the situation that you're in.
Oh, so you think it's okay if someone's attacking you just to get closer to them?
There again, sir, every situation is different.
Well, this situation, do you think it was reasonable then for Mr. Reeves to get
Your Honor, I
closer?
object.
sustained.
Mr. Reeves told you that Mr. Oulson told him that he was going to kick his ass.
There again, sir, I'm not sure if that was the terminology or not that he used.
We just heard it yesterday.
There again, sir, I don't recall that. Let me look. Do you have the page number there?
I can give you the whole transcript.
I've got the transcript.
Okay, well then.
I was just hoping that maybe you would have the page number. Pardon me, Your Honor, I'm trying to locate it real quick.
Not a problem. That's right. He does say that many saying, and this is Mr. Reeves, I think that he was talking about texting his daughter. If it was any of my, there's fucking there 3 or 4 times, this ain't my fucking business. or I'll kick your ass. Whatever he's saying, he was threatening. I'm going to be candid to you. I don't remember exactly.
So that's what he was telling you, right?
Yes, sir.
And you believed that Mr. Reeves was forthcoming to you, right?
Objection.
Sorry,
Yes.
Now, let's talk about that phone a little bit more.
Sir?
Let's talk about that phone a little bit more.
Okay.
You didn't know the weight of the phone at that point in time, correct?
That's correct.
But you would agree that if that phone was being thrown at someone else, it's being used not as a phone, but as a weapon.
It could be, yes, sir.
And you would agree that that phone can cause great bodily harm?
It could, yes, sir.
It can cause death?
It'd be difficult, but I guess anything is possible, sir.
It'd be difficult. Well, tell me why you think it would be difficult.
Judge object.
He opened the door on it, Judge.
Judge, can we approach, please?
To suggest that you can't cause death with a phone.
I have no medical training, sir,
Okay.
other than first aid.
Yeah. In fact, not only a phone, hands can kill.
Yes, sir.
And you would agree that if a phone is thrown at somebody and it hits them in the head, not necessarily going to cause an open wound, right?
It might not, yes, sir.
There's a lot of factors that you have to consider, right?
That's correct, sir.
Did you all ever weigh this phone?
Yes, sir.
Was that after we weighed it?
I believe so, sir.
And you found this phone to weigh as much as a cue ball, correct? Cue ball, like a billiards cue ball?
I'm not familiar with the weight of a cue ball, sir.
Well, if I had thrown a cue ball at you, it could cause great bodily harm, right?
Yes, sir.
It could cause death, correct?
Possibly, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, of importance was, in this case, Mr. Reeves' disabilities, right? What was his medical condition, his physical condition? You never asked him that, correct?
No, sir, he volunteered it.
He had to tell you that he had arthritis, bad back, correct?
Yes, sir.
A whole slew of ailments that he was telling you he was experiencing at the time of this incident.
Yes, sir.
Did you ask him for particulars of that?
No, sir, I did not.
Meaning, Mr. Reeves, tell me what, you've got arthritis in your hand. Tell me what that does to you. You never asked him that.
No, sir, I did not.
Mr. Reeves, you've got arthritis in your shoulders and in your spinal column. Tell me what that does to you. Never asked him that.
No, sir.
Mr. Reeves, do you have difficulty getting up off a chair? What do you have to do in order to get up off of a chair, Mr. Reeves? Never asked him that.
And he never told me that. No, sir.
My question is, did you ask him that?
Oh, no, sir.
Did you ask him, Mr. Reeves, you've got these shoes that you have to kind of pull some strings there. Are you wearing those shoes for a reason? Didn't ask him that.
No, sir.
Did you ask him how heavy he was?
I did.
Did you ask him, hey, was that your normal weight while you were a law enforcement officer?
No, sir, but he told me he'd gained some weight.
Did you ask him if that was his weight while he was the head of security for Bush Entertainment?
No, sir.
Did you ask him if he had deteriorated? during the last few years?
No, sir.
You asked him what his limitations were.
No, sir.
But he told you he was a physical wreck, right?
Yes, sir.
That was important in your investigation, was it not?
As we've talked, yes, sir, everything's important.
Well, but that in particular was important, was it not?
It was important, sir.
But you didn't ask any follow-up questions at all?
No, sir, he appeared to be healthy.
Oh, is that back to your medical degree?
Judge, objection, Judge.
Sustained.
Is that because you now have the qualifications to be able to assess someone's condition by visual sight?
I can observe someone. He's able to walk around. He's not under, doesn't need a cane, doesn't need any of that stuff to get around.
So you're okay if you don't need a cane and you can walk?
Well, he didn't appear to be physically disabled.
Do you think that individuals in their 70s can perform just as easily as someone in their 30s or 40s?
There again, that depends, sir.
And that's why we have to ask those questions, right?
Yes, sir.
Did you consider Mr. Reeves' age?
Yes, sir, I knew he was 71.
Okay. And did you ask him, hey, why did you retire from Bush Entertainment, such a great position as head of security? Why did you do that, Mr. Reeves? You ask him that?
No, sir.
Pretty good job, right?
I don't like Busch Gardens.
Head of security for Busch Gardens.
I don't like Busch Gardens.
Oh, you don't like Busch Gardens?
No, sir.
Okay. And then let's talk about this eye. Mr. Reeves had told you that he had been hit somewhere in the eye area, correct? The head.
Yes, sir.
And he told you that he was experiencing some difficulty at the time of your interview. Correct?
With his eye, yes, sir.
With his eye. Now, by this time, had you interviewed Mrs. Reeves? Not yet, right?
No, sir.
Okay, that was after the first interview of Mr. Reeves.
Yes, sir. He requested, or told me that I needed to speak to her.
Okay. Now, Mr. Reeves also told you something very important. And that is immediately after he fired the weapon, he placed that gun on his lap, took his hands away, right?
He said that he put the gun on his leg and that I don't recall him saying that he moved his hands back.
Well, what did Corporal Hamilton tell you then when he came up and took the gun from Mr. Reeves's knee? That Mr. Reeves's hands weren't anywhere near the knee, right?
I don't recall him telling me that, sir.
Well, what's the issue with it?
I don't recall. I knew the gun was on his leg. I don't know if he had his hand on top of the gun. I recall Mr. Hamilton telling me that he walked over and took the gun from him, that he had it
On his knee?
on his knee.
Okay. And so you would agree, and I'm sure you've been trained in this as well, you would agree that in a situation where you're in a darkened area, you're in a theater, there's been a shooting, you certainly don't want to be displaying that weapon out to the entire group because someone else may have a gun and start shooting, correct?
That would be a very pertinent thing to do, not to display it.
So Mr. Reeves, immediately after the firing the shot, was in training protocol, putting that gun immediately on his knee out of sight.
Yes, sir. Common sense.
Well, it's common sense and training, correct?
Yes, sir.
immediately after the shot took place, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're taught as a police officer that the minute that you stop the threat, you don't keep shooting, right?
That's correct.
One shot in this case, and only one. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Training protocol. He was following that training.
Yes, sir.
You finished that interview with Mr. Reeves. And let's talk about the time, because I want to make sure we've got this time sequence nice and tight. What time did you finish with Mr. Reeves? 3:40. I thought you wrote it down on that piece of paper there.
I finished at 3:40.
At 3:40.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so now you are going into what investigative mode? What are you doing now? After you finish that, you go to Mrs. Reeves, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so let's talk. What time do you start Mrs. Reeves?
One moment, sir.
I'm sorry.
I started that interview at 16:25.
Also known as 4:25, right?
Yes, sir.
16:25. And you finished that interview at 16:38.
That's correct.
How many minutes is that?
That's 30,
I hope it's not 30.
no, 30, 45 minutes. Oh, you talking about for Miss Reeves? I apologize, sir.
Yes, that's okay.
That's 13 minutes.
You had a 13-minute interview with Mrs. Reeves.
That's correct.
And this one you recorded immediately. No pre-recording by you.
That's correct.
And she was a witness, not a suspect.
That's correct.
And so you didn't violate the protocol of the sheriff's office.
That's correct.
And Mrs. Reeves likewise told you that she was scared.
Objection, Judge, to hearsay.
Sustained.
Okay. You spoke to Mrs. Reeves for 13 minutes, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so, after that 13-minute interview with Mrs. Reeves, you decide to go back and interview Curtis again, right? So let's try to take the scenario if I can. Alan, Angela, right?
Yes, sir.
Curtis,
Yes, sir.
Mrs. Reeves,
Yes, sir.
now back to Curtis, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so when you go back to Curtis, what time was that? I've got it right here if that makes it easier.
16:43.
16:43. 16:43, right? Which would have been what?
4:43.
4:43. And then you finished that at 16:48.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Let's talk about between 16:43 and your last interview with Mrs. Reeves. You finished Mrs. Reeves' interview at 16:38. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you started Mr. Reeves' second interview at 16:43.
According to my notes, yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
How many minutes is that?
5?
5 minutes, okay. And so in between that period of time, after you interviewed Mrs. Reeves for the second time, your testimony is that you go to the command center.
We have a meeting. It's not really a center, but command center, but we have a meeting out in front of the theater.
Okay, so you have to, let's see if I can get this correctly. You were interviewing Mrs. Reeves in the same room?
I believe so, sir.
Okay, and so you have to leave that room, have to leave the theater, you gotta go through the doors,
Right.
and go out into the parking lot where you had your makeshift command center, right?
That meeting occurs right there outside the front of the theater, right there in front of the box office.
Okay, and would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury again the purpose of that meeting?
To discuss the case, the information that patrol deputy or detectives had received from their witnesses, their interviews.
To discuss the case. So that's a very important meeting, is it not?
Yes, sir.
Because you're trying to get information from all the various sources of witnesses that are being interviewed, correct?
Yes, sir.
And these witnesses are being given voluntary statements for them to write down what, in their opinion, they saw. Right?
Yes, sir.
And so that's a lot to look over, right?
Yes, sir.
And so it must have taken you probably, what, a minute to get from the room that you were interviewing Mrs. Reeves to that meeting up front?
Possibly, yes, sir.
So that leaves us 4 minutes. And so now, it must have taken you at least 3 minutes to go from the meeting to go back to Mr. Reeves, right?
I'm not for sure, sir, how long it would have taken.
Well, he was in the back, right?
Yes,
In a
sir.
car. And the meeting was out front of the theater.
Yes, sir.
But it'd take you at least 3 minutes to get there, right?
There again, sir, I don't know. It would have
So
taken.
you must have had a 1-minute meeting with your group outside the theater, because those are the numbers, right?
Yes, sir.
A 1-minute meeting, you had to discuss all of the evidence that allegedly had been uncovered at that point, right? 1 minute.
I tend to believe, sir, it was longer than that.
Well, the numbers don't add up, right?
That's correct.
And so tell me who you spoke to outside the Cobb Theater for a minute that gave you enough information for you to go back and tell Mr. Reeves that you were going to charge him with second-degree murder.
We had stood there and talked. The detectives, command staff was there. Sergeant or Captain Eckley, Major Corbin, the sheriff, Detective Harris, Sergeant Sessa, and they had said that no one had seen a punch being thrown and that no one had seen the suspect coming over the chair.
Oh, you must have told him, wait a minute, I spoke to Mr. Hamilton. He says, yeah, that, Oulson was leaning over the chair and he was yelling and he was cursing. I'm sure you told Captain Sessa that.
Your Honor, I'd object to the characterization of the question. Leaning over and coming over are two very different things.
Sustained.
What did you tell Captain Sessa about your interview with Mr. Hamilton?
Sergeant Sessa.
Sergeant, sorry.
I think we didn't go into in depth. We didn't go in depth. We simply wanted to know if anybody had seen a punch being thrown or anything being thrown at the victim, or at the suspect. We wanted to determine if anybody thought that the shooting was justifiable.
Well, in a minute, that's hard to do, right?
There again, sir, my times could be off.
Well, times are important, aren't they?
They are.
They're critical. They're part of the evidence, right?
That's correct.
And in a homicide case especially, we can't afford to not be correct, right?
It's very important, sir.
And so, nobody saw a punch being thrown. Nobody saw a phone. That was like the deciding factor for you, right?
Being thrown.
The being thrown.
Yes, sir.
And so, darkened theater, correct?
Yes, sir.
You don't know how dark it was because you weren't in there to see it for yourself.
That's correct, sir.
You hadn't gone back into the crime scene and said to the manager, please turn the lighting to the lighting that was present during the previews so that I can sit in this chair that Mr. Reeves was sitting and I could experience what he was experiencing. You never did that
No, sir.
before you had that meeting with, I guess it's the brass of the sheriff's office, right?
That's correct, sir.
You never went to the manager and told the manager, hey, by the way, I also want you, in addition to put the lights down, I want you to put those previews on. Because I want to sit in that chair and I want to experience whether the loudness of the previews
Your Honor, I'd object.
had any effect.
From the approach, or it's just an improper form of questioning.
I'll overrule.
You never did that, did you?
No, sir, I did not.
And did you tell the brass there at the Pasco Sheriff's Office, said, by the way, I haven't even gone into the crime scene? Did you tell them that?
No, sir. We were aware of,
Well, you may have been aware. You didn't tell them that you had not been in that crime scene. Is that correct?
that's correct.
Detective, the first time that you went into that crime scene was at 5:32 in the afternoon.
If I may.
You may, please. You want me to try to hide it for you really quickly?
Yes, sir, because I don't seem to have it noted here. You have the crime scene line?
I think I do. At my fingertips.
Thank you, sir.
May I approach?
You may.
It's in the first page, Detective, very top.
There you go. Yeah, I apologize, sir. 1732. That's
Thank
correct.
you. May I have it back?
Yes, sir.
Now, let's talk about that very important process of the case, because your job's not over, right?
No, sir.
You may have told Mr. Reeves and charged Mr. Reeves at that point with second-degree murder. Let's talk about the number. Was it 2 hours, and in 2 hours and 16 minutes from your arrival, you're charging Mr. Reeves with second-degree murder? In 2 hours and 15 minutes, 16 minutes. That's why I became a lawyer. My math is... Tell me if I'm right.
About that, yes, sir.
Okay. So now, your job's not over, is it?
No, sir.
Your job now, you're going at 5:32 for the first time into this, and let me call it an incident scene, because that's what it is, correct?
Objection. I don't even know how to phrase this, improper.
It's an incident scene, it's where the incident happened. Correct?
Overrule. Overrule.
It's only a crime scene if someone's at fault. Would you not agree?
I consider it to be a crime scene.
You consider it to be a crime scene. Okay, so we'll call it a crime scene. So now you go into the crime scene and Detective Smith is there, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you have some forensic people there as well, right?
That's correct.
You already know about the phone,
Yes, sir.
is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But you still don't know what seat Mr. Reeves was actually in.
Pointed out that seat at that time.
Well, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
Okay. And so when you go in there, you don't know what seat Mr. Reeves was in.
I knew that it was on the back row. I knew that it was in the center, but the actual numbered seat I did not know.
Okay. And so when you go in there, do you see the phone? Do you see the phone at 5:32 in the position of that aisle?
I'm not for sure, sir, if I saw it there or if it was pinned with a pin marker.
Meaning that there could have been a pin marker there, but the phone may not have been there.
That's correct.
And so I'm sure that at some point in time in your investigation post-entry of the crime scene, that you discovered that the phone had a black case. Correct?
Yes, sir.
And so if, excuse me a second, Your Honor. If I am throwing a dark object in a darkened theater, you may not be able to see it. Right?
That would make sense, yes, sir.
That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It would be difficult, it would be possible that that could happen.
So did you go up to Smith and say, let me see the phone? Let me see the phone. I want to see the phone.
No, sir, I knew what a cell phone looked like. We did not want to. We don't handle phones. We had photographed it. We knew where it was at. We had it pinned. They're handling the crime scene properly.
Well, you hadn't been in there. If you arrived at 2:15, you hadn't been in there for at least 3.5 hours, right?
That's correct.
And so you don't know what was happening in there with Detective Smith at the helm, right?
There again, sir, I have complete confidence in my team of forensic investigators and Detective Aaron Smith.
So let me ask you this question. So, of importance, obviously, to you was the darkness of the theater, right?
That's one of the important things. That's correct.
Okay, and so at that point in time, at 5:32 in the afternoon, did you go and get a manager to say, I want you to dim those lights?
Objection, asked and answered.
No, that's at 5:32. At 5:32, did you do that?
No, sir.
Overruled.
Was that not important at that point?
I'm sorry, sir?
Was that not important?
What?
To get those lights down while now you're in the crime scene for the first time.
Yes, sir.
So was that not important to you?
I did not, I didn't do it, sir. At the time, I didn't think of that.
This is your only opportunity, Detective, you would agree with me, to recreate the scene that Mr. Reeves was experiencing. You could have sat in that chair. You could have put the lights on at the preview level. You could have put the previews on. You could have had someone that was 6'4" from the battalion of officers that you had there standing where Mr. Oulson was. You did none of that.
No, sir.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you get your crime scene technicians that were there in order to memorialize by cameras that very experience?
That day, no, sir.
I thought you were in charge of this homicide case.
I was.
Did you ask Mr. Smith, hey, Detective Smith, you know, we've got some lady here by the name of Amy Parrish who has had extensive training in being able to capture photographs in darkened areas. She's got some expertise in that. Let's get her to do that here. Did you do that with Detective Smith?
Not that, no, sir, not that day.
Not that day.
No, sir.
Why not that day?
I didn't think of it, sir, at the time.
You didn't think of it.
No, sir.
And was that because you had only had one case in the past dealing with self-defense, Detective? Is that the reason why you didn't do these things? Difficult question, isn't it?
I tried my best to do the very best job that I could as far as the investigation.
Detective, I don't doubt that you tried to do your best. That wasn't the question.
Right.
The question is, do you think that the reason that you didn't do these things is because at that point in time you did not have the experience in dealing with a self-defense case?
I had limited experience with that. Yes, sir. That could be a possibility.
Possibilities are dangerous in our criminal justice system, you would agree?
Yes, sir.
We can't afford to make mistakes, can we, Detective?
No, sir.
Because you have a man's life in your hands as well.
Your Honor, at this point, I would object.
Sustained. If you have much more, it's time for a
We do have quite a
break.
bit.
All right, let's take a 10-minute recess, please. Remember my instructions during the break? Thank you.
All rise, court is in recess for 10 minutes.
Hey, Stephen? Hang on one sec. That new camera, all right. Are we ready to proceed? Okay, Tina.
Jurors in the courtroom, Your Honor.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Were you all able to abide by my instructions during the recess? All righty. Mr. Escobar, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Proctor, you're still under oath.
Thank you, ma'am.
Detective, I'll keep calling you detective, I'm sorry. Mr. Proctor.
That's fine, sir.
Before going back into that theater, or before going into the theater for the first time, anybody give you the name of Joanna Turner?
Not by name, sir.
Well, what did they give you if they didn't give it to you by name?
After the meeting, or after I went into the theater, there was a meeting of,
We're not there yet. I'm saying
Okay.
before you went into the theater.
yes, sir.
At 5:32 in the afternoon.
Yes, sir.
Did the name Joanna Turner, was that given to you?
No, sir.
Despite the fact that you had the meeting with supposedly all of the brass and discussing all of the interviews and all of the voluntary forms and all of that. Right?
Yes, sir.
And certainly nobody gave you a voluntary form there at that meeting with the brass that had the name Joanna Turner for you to read.
No, sir.
In fact, you didn't read a single voluntary statement that had been given by any witness prior to going into the theater at 5:32.
The Hamiltons.
Well, that was because you interviewed them, right?
Right.
No, I'm talking about from the brass at the meeting.
No, sir, I didn't read any written statements.
Okay. So now you go into the theater, and even though it was 2013, we are at an age where surveillance cameras are pretty common, right?
Yes, sir.
It didn't have to be 2022 for that to happen, right?
That's correct, sir.
In 2013, surveillance cameras were pretty popular.
Wasn't it 2014, Mr.
Excuse me, 2014.
Yes, sir.
Am I correct?
They were popular, yes, sir.
They'd been popular for quite some time.
Sir?
They'd been popular for quite some time.
Yes, sir.
And so when you went into that theater, you immediately realized that there were cameras in that theater, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so as you walked into the general theater, you looked up, there was one to your right, and there was another one to your left, right?
And Theater 10?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so when you looked up and saw those cameras, you realized with all the years of law enforcement experience that you had that video surveillance is important, right?
Yes, sir.
And when you see cameras, you're going to go and watch that film as quickly as you can.
Yes, sir.
Because you don't want that film to be destroyed, right?
That's correct.
And that film can have incredible opportunities in your investigation, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so you didn't do that. You didn't go to management at the cop theater and say, Mr. Manager, I'd like to be able to see whatever is on that film. You didn't do that.
No, sir, I did not.
And you would agree with me that you later found out that you didn't even have to go to the IT room upstairs in order to view that video, correct? You could have done it from the manager's desk.
I wasn't aware of that, sir.
You weren't.
No, sir.
It's because you never asked anybody, right?
No, sir, I'm not computer savvy. I'm definitely not video savvy. We had those people with the sheriff's office there to
Cybercrime.
Thank you, sir. We had cyber crimes there to obtain all of that.
So if you're not computer savvy and you've got the battalion of cybercrime there, you had Bousson, correct?
Yes, sir.
You had Lindsay, correct?
Yes, sir.
You had Pepinella, correct?
Yes, sir. I'm not for sure who was there the day of.
Those guys are really good, aren't they?
They are.
They're highly trained, correct?
They are.
They're highly trained to preserve evidence, correct?
They are.
In fact, that's why they were there. Correct?
To obtain the video, yes, sir.
Well, not only to obtain it correctly,
That's correct.
and to make sure that nobody, even the cop theater, could destroy it, correct?
That would be correct, sir.
Because when you're doing an investigation, you can't trust anybody else. You've got to put that trust only in the people that are employed by the Pasco Sheriff's Office, correct?
We'd like to have it that way, yes, sir.
And that's why they were there.
Yes, sir.
And so did you go over to Detective Bousson and say, Detective Bousson, I see that we've got some video here. I need you to go and I need you to preserve that evidence, period.
They told me that it was being preserved.
That's not my question.
Yes, sir.
Did you go to Detective Bousson, who is an expert in cybercrime, and say, Detective Bousson, you're here for this purpose. I want you to go and preserve that video evidence?
No, sir, I did not tell him that.
Well, why not?
He knows his job. That's his, that's what he does.
Well, unless Detective Smith tells him, I don't want you to do it, I'm going to handle it myself. Right?
Judge, I'm going to object. Cause for speculation on the part of this witness.
Sustained.
You would agree that Detective Smith was the crime scene detective, right?
Yes, sir.
And he had to make sure, like you, that things were going to be properly preserved because he is the crime scene detective.
That's correct, sir.
And in 2013,
14.
but in 2013, the year before, when he was in missing persons, you didn't know anything about Detective Smith as far as his capabilities in cybercrime. He wasn't in cybercrime, right?
I knew that he knew how to obtain video. He had assisted me before in robberies where he had obtained the video for me in other cases.
So he had obtained the video. Do you know what type of background he had in order to be able to do that?
No, sir. I knew that I didn't know all of his training, but I knew that he was very capable of obtaining the video.
But you would agree that obtaining the video doesn't mean that you tell the cop theater, hey, listen, do whatever you all want to do with the video and then give me a copy later on. That's not what you expected.
And I don't think that's what occurred.
My question is, that's not what you expected, right?
No, sir.
Okay, so you pretty much didn't have even a conversation with Smith about the video because you assumed that he was going to do something.
I remember the conversation occurring that the cop theater was not able to produce the video the day of the incident.
Oh, wait a minute. The cop theater was not able to produce the video, but you had cybercrime there that could extract the hard drives in the proper way and preserve the video, right? You agree with that?
There again, sir, that's above my, my knowledge. I don't,
Well, you could have spoken to Busson and say, hey, Busson, I guess someone in the cop theater is saying that they're not gonna turn over the videos. What can we do here? Did you have that conversation with Busson?
I did not.
You knew at that moment that the cop theater had a liability interest of their own, right?
That would be a possibility, yes, sir.
And you certainly didn't want the cop theater to be doing anything with that video, did you?
No, sir, I did not.
Did you know that at the very moment that you had walked in to that theater tent, that the cop theater was remotely looking at the video? Did you know that?
No, sir, I did not.
So the cop theater can look at the video remotely, you're there, you can't look at the video.
It was my understanding, sir, that we could not view the video that day.
Well, was it your understanding that Detective Smith told Busson, hey, get out of here, I'm handling this?
Judge, I'm gonna object. It calls for speculation.
No, there's no speculation about that.
Sustained, there is
Judge
speculation.
Busson is going to be testifying for me.
Okay.
Okay, so what else do you do in that crime scene other than talk to Detective Smith for a few minutes and leave?
I also, Detective Smith gave me a rundown as to where the evidence that they had collected, the evidence they were in the process of collecting, where the victim and his wife and the suspect and his wife were sitting.
Okay, did he give you the measurements?
No, sir.
Did he give you the measurements of the seats?
No, sir.
You knew that the seats had arms, correct?
Sir?
You knew the seats had arms, right?
Yes, sir.
And did those arms move up and down?
I'm not aware, sir.
And so you left the cop theater without obtaining that video, those hard drives that day, right?
That's correct, sir.
And in fact, you had posted, had you not, officers there at the cop theater to not allow anybody to come in to the cop theater, right?
Theater 10, yes, sir.
And you became aware that the cop theater sent an IT person from Mulberry to seize the actual hard drives that very night. Correct?
I wasn't aware of that, sir.
You're not aware of that today?
I wasn't aware of that.
This is the first time you've heard of it.
I was not.
Objection, counsel's testifying, facts not in evidence.
I'm not testifying, I'm asking if this is the first time he's heard that.
I know, but where's the facts coming from you?
Oh, it's Mr. Sillis.
I'm gonna overrule.
The first time that you have heard that a Mr. Sillis, an IT person from Mulberry, came over that night, penetrated security there at the cop theater and seized the videos is today?
That's correct, sir.
So I guess Detective Smith never shared that with you.
I wasn't aware of it, sir. He could have, but I don't remember that conversation occurring.
Well, if that had occurred, you'd be disappointed.
I wasn't aware of it, sir.
Were you disappointed now that you heard that today?
I'm disappointed that I didn't know it before I'm sitting here in front of a jury.
Well, are you disappointed that someone seized multitude of hard drives right under your nose?
I'm disappointed that I didn't know that.
Now, Detective,
Yes, sir.
you didn't know that the hard drives from the cop theater, especially all the hard drives dealing with Theater 10 and lobby and what have you didn't know that those hard drives had been seized and flown to Alabama?
No, sir.
Well, You didn't go to Alabama to go and retrieve those hard drives?
I did.
Well, where did you think those hard drives had come from? Thin air?
No, sir.
Object, Judge.
I will rephrase, Your Honor. Where
Thank
did you
you.
think those hard drives came from?
I was not aware that the hard drives were in Wesley Chapel.
You didn't believe that the hard drives that you were getting from Alabama were the ones that were taken from the Wesley Chapel Cobb Theater?
Yes, sir. I thought the ones from Alabama are the ones from Wesley Chapel. I understand that now, but at the time, I thought that the hard drives were being remotely, that the feed was remotely to that location.
So are you telling me that when you went to Alabama, you thought that the hard drives that you were picking up were not the actual hard drives? You thought that there were some kind of copies that were done for you at the pleasure of the Cobb Theater?
No, sir. That's what I'm saying. I'm not video savvy. I don't understand all that working. And I did not realize that the hard drives, I didn't realize that they were even in Wesley Chapel.
You didn't realize that the hard drives were in Wesley Chapel because you never went into the IT room to take a look at the surveillance equipment, correct?
That's correct.
You didn't know the make and model of the system, correct?
No, sir, but I had people there that did.
You didn't know the make and model of each hard drive?
No, sir.
You didn't know which hard drive belonged to which camera, correct?
That's correct.
You didn't know if you had multiple hard drives that were supplied by any particular camera?
That's correct.
You didn't know anything about that system.
Absolutely correct.
And so, at some point in time, much days later, right? You and Smith decide, I think we better go to Alabama.
Your Honor, will we briefly approach?
Yes.
Back to those hard drives.
Yes, sir.
You went all the way to Alabama days later, right?
That's correct.
And you went with Detective Smith
That's correct.
to go and retrieve those particular hard drives that had been in the Cobb Theater on the very moment of this incident.
That's correct, sir.
And you didn't go to just Cobb Theater management. You had to go to a lawyer's office for the Cobb Theater to go and retrieve those hard drives.
That's correct, sir.
And when you got the box or the luggage that the hard drives were in, it had a lock on it, right?
That's correct.
And so there at the lawyer's office, you didn't say, hey, lawyer, open this box so that we can see what's in it and we can inventory it and we can take photos before I am taking it back. Right? You didn't do any of that.
No, sir.
You left the box locked, not knowing what was in the box.
That's correct, sir.
And certainly you had done nothing prior to going to Alabama to go and check and see what system they had there at the Cobb Theater so that you could correlate as to whether, okay, this hard drive goes here, and this hard drive goes here, and this. You didn't do any of that.
No, sir.
And so now you're getting this box with, you don't even know how many hard drives were in there, right?
I don't, sir.
And so you get this box that was locked, and you take it with you, and you got to come. Did you fly or you drove?
We drove.
You drove. You drove all the way back to Pasco County, and certainly, when you got to Pasco County and you got to the evidence room, certainly you opened that box and said, okay, let's inventory it before it goes into evidence.
I did not.
Well, that's the proper protocol, right?
No, sir.
Oh, it's not. So you can just get a box that has nothing that you know of. I mean, it could have had 3 kilos of cocaine and you would have known it, right?
I'm sorry, do that again?
Object, is that a
That
question
box-
or a statement?
That box could have had anything in it and you would have never known it.
I was told that the box contained,
Well, I
The hard
realize
drives.
you were told that
Yes,
by
sir.
some lawyer that was representing the interests of Cop Theater, right?
yes, sir.
But my question is that you did not know before you entered that box into evidence what was in that box. For all you know, it could have been anything. Right?
Yes, sir. I was told that it was the hard drives.
Okay. And so now you put that in evidence, right?
Yes, sir.
And the person that you call on in order to image, to copy those hard drives, is the person that was at the Cop Theater the night of January the 13th of 2014, Mr. Bousson, right?
I don't know who copies those, sir.
Well, do you know that he was the one that copied those for you?
He's part of that team.
So it stayed in evidence, tell me, stayed in evidence for a week without knowing what was in there?
Sir, I don't know.
How about a month?
I don't know, sir.
How about 3 months?
Let the witness answer, please.
My apologies.
Sir, I'm not aware how long the box remained in evidence. Cyber crimes, the state attorney's office, they were handling all of that aspect of it. We had CDs of the incident, the shooting, and I don't know how long the box remained in property and evidence.
And those CDs that you had were given to you days after the incident
A couple days later, that's correct.
from somebody there with Cobb Theater, right?
Detective Smith obtained those.
Okay. Do you know how? Do you know if he got it from a competent source, like a IT person, a computer engineer, a cybercrime expert?
I don't know who he obtained those from.
You don't. Okay. And so then at some point in time, though that box, were you responsible for also taking that box out and taking it to some gentleman in Orlando?
No, sir.
That wasn't you. That was Detective Smith?
Yes, sir. I went to Alabama to get it, and I brought it back with Detective Smith. We put it into evidence, and that was it. I simply accompanied him there for the long drive.
Detective, you would agree that you were not happy having to go to Alabama to get a vital piece of evidence that should have been preserved right here in Pasco County, right?
Do that again, sir? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'll tell you again. You were not happy over the fact that you had to go to Alabama to pick up a vital piece of evidence in this case when it should have been done right here by your cybercrime unit in Pasco County.
There again, sir, I'm not aware of how cyber crimes, how to obtain that. We were that's the way it occurred. I didn't know that the DVRs were even in Wesley Chapel. There again, cyber crimes is the one that handles that. My happiness, I wanted to obtain the video.
Let me ask you this question.
My happiness has no bearing on the trip to Alabama.
Well, let me ask you a question. You certainly interviewed John Sillis, who was the IT person that came in the middle of the night and took the hard drive. You did that, right?
I did not.
Or did you direct someone to do that? Did you direct some of your detectives, hey, this John Silas, we need to talk to him? Did you direct anybody to do that?
Sir, as I've testified to earlier, I did not know that the video had been removed, or drives.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Redirect?
May I have a moment, please,
You
Judge?
may. Is that your pen, Mr. Escobar?
Oh, thank you, Your Honor. These are hard to, they don't have much ink in them.
Oh, right. It's a new wave pens.
I know. Thank you, Detective.
Yes, sir.
And Your Honor, my exhibit.
May it please the court, counsel. Mr. Proctor, do you have a copy of Alan Hamilton's statement?
I do not, sir.
Okay.
Counsel does.
I've got it. Sure. Defense exhibit, I think, number 20. It's in the back. Defense exhibit number 20. Excuse me. Yeah, number 21.
For the record, it's defense exhibit number 21. May I approach the witness?
You may.
Detective Proctor, I'm going to ask that you look at that statement, not only look at it, but I'm going to ask you to read it to yourself and see if anywhere in that written statement, Mr. Hamilton stated that it was dark in the theater, and the second thing I'm going to ask you to do is see if he ever uses the word silhouette in his written statement.
If I may.
That's what. I'll just move on.
I'm sorry, but there's no mention of silhouette here?
Is there any mention of dark?
No, sir.
Mr. Garcia, I think I need to clarify for the record, obviously that has not been admitted yet.
Yes, ma'am. Now, Mr. Proctor, let's talk about notes. I think you indicated on cross-examination, based on questions from Mr. Escobar, that you take notes when you interviewed Mr. Hamilton and Mrs. Hamilton.
That's
Right.
that's correct, sir.
And once you have memorialized your police report, you destroy those notes.
I'm going to
I,
object.
I do.
Sustained. That was.
Right. You took notes, right?
Yes, sir.
Did you write a police report in this case
Yes, sir, I did.
in reference to your interview with Mr. Hamilton and Mrs. Hamilton?
That's correct.
Did you document in that report what they had told you?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did your notes comport with the report?
Yes, sir, they did.
After the report was written, did you then destroy the notes?
Yes, sir, I did.
Was there anything different in the notes as compared to the report?
No, sir, there was.
All right. Now, on cross-examination, Mr. Escobar went to great lengths asking you, well, did you ask Mr. Reeves about his disabilities? Did you go into this? Did you go into that? Do you remember that?
Yes, sir, I did.
On the second interview, did you ask Mr. Reeves, is there anything else you want to tell me?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. Now, let's talk about on cross-examination. Mr. Escobar asked you, Mr. Proctor, did you go into the theater and did you ask him to put the manager to put the lights on and the previews on and so on and so forth, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, as you're sitting here today, Mr. Proctor, is there any way that you could have gone back in time and done everything in that theater exactly the way it occurred on January 13, 2014? And by that, I mean, have the defendant sitting in the same seat, his wife there, obviously all the other witnesses that were in that theater, right?
Yes, sir.
With the previews playing at the volume with the correct lighting at that time.
That's
No.
also speculation as to whether he could have done it or not. I mean, we'd have to bring the witnesses in.
Judge?
Oliver.
Right?
There's no way you can recreate it.
Okay. Mr. Escobar went into great lengths about you going in there and you sitting and seeing this, right?
Yes, sir.
Does it matter what you saw or you heard?
And
If it's you,
yes, sir.
it doesn't matter, right?
No.
Judge, I'm going to object. Move to strike. Leading.
Sustained.
Move to strike.
Rephrase.
Mr. Proctor, what's important is what the defendant saw through his own eyes.
That's correct.
What he saw, what he heard, not you.
That's correct, sir.
May I have a moment, Judge?
You may.
Because I don't have any further questions of
Can we
Mr.
approach
Proctor.
real quickly?
Yes. released. You're probably going to be on standby. Standby. All right, Mr. Proctor, you're free to go, but if you do get called back, you have to go. Okay? If you do get called back, you have to come back.
Yes, ma'am.
But-
I'm out of this area. Can you give me a day's notice?
We will, Your Honor.
All right,
Thank you.
you'll get a day's notice.
Thank you, Your Honor. It's good seeing you.
You too.
Yes. Been a while.
State?
The state would call Mark Turner.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give in this call to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Go ahead, Mr.
Thank you.
Rosenwasser.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please state your name and spell your first and last name for the court reporter?
Mark Turner, M-A-R-K-Turner.
And you don't have to tell us exactly where you live, but what city do you currently live in?
Brandon,
All right. And back January 13th of 2014, what city were you living in?
Wesley Chapel.
Are you currently employed?
I'm retired.
All right. What did you do before you were retired?
26 years in the Air Force and 10 years in the aviation industry.
Okay, and just very, very briefly, we don't need an entire history, but very briefly, what did you do in the Air Force?
I began as an enlisted man and then went to officer training school, aviation school, and spent most of my time in the intelligence arena.
Back on January 13th of 2014, did you go to the Cobb Theater to see the movie Lone Survivor?
I did.
And who'd you go there with?
My wife.
All right. Is there a particular part of the theater that you sit in when you go to the movie theater?
I usually try to find an aisle seat up high.
And were you able to do it on that particular day?
Yes, sir.
When you went into the Cobb Theater, so you walk up a ramp to get in there, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
All right, then you have to turn around to your left or right, depending on what side of the theater you're on.
Yes.
And you look back at the seats, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, when you walked in, do you recall whether or not the previews were playing at that time?
They were.
Do you recall what the lighting conditions were like?
Dimmed, but you could see your way through pretty clearly.
All right, and we're obviously going to be talking about a shooting. The lighting conditions that you're going to describe now, were they the same lighting conditions at the time of the shooting?
Yes.
All right, so let's tell the members of the jury about that. Was it dark like when the actual movie is playing?
No,
All right, so there's lights on at this point.
that's correct.
All right, not the full house lights, but I guess as you indicated, dimmed.
Yes.
All right, so when you're looking at the entire theater, can you see the rows?
Yes.
Can you clearly see them?
Yes.
Can you see people sitting in the rows?
Yes.
How about the aisles? Clear enough to see the aisles?
Yes.
Clear enough to see the steps?
Yes.
Did you have any concern for your safety? And I don't mean like in a super dangerous way, but walking up to go find seats.
No.
All right. Did you need a flashlight from your phone or anything like that?
No, sir.
Could you see 5-10 seats away from you?
You could.
All right. So you make your way up to where? Is it the back row?
Back row, I sat in the first seat on the aisle. My wife sat inward.
Okay. So if the screen's behind me and you're facing the theater, were you on the left side of the theater or the right side of the theater?
On the right side.
Okay. Well, that would be facing the screen. You're on the right side.
That's correct.
All right. So if you're sitting, you're all the way to the right of the theater in the back row.
That's correct.
All right. Now, when you sat down, you indicated the lighting conditions were the same as you described it.
Yes.
All right. You recall what the volume was like?
It was elevated, but you could still converse
Okay, and when you say elevated, that's coming from whatever's coming from the movie theater screen?
Right.
All right. And did you have any difficulty hearing your wife, the person you came with?
Not at all.
Did you have any difficulty hearing anyone else around you at that point?
Not so much. No.
All right. Could you hear, the chattering in the movie theater?
Yes.
Right. Could you specifically hear what people were saying, or maybe the better way is, were you listening to other people's conversations?
No.
All right. So you couldn't hear the conversation because you weren't paying attention to it,
Correct.
but you could hear that people were talking.
Yes.
I'm going to object. It's like 10
Last-
leading questions.
I understand.
Last two. Sustain.
Based on the level of the volume in the theater, did you have any difficulty hearing anyone else?
No.
All right, we're going to be talking about the shooting incident. First of all, did you know any of the people involved in the shooting?
I did not.
Did you later learn the name of the person that did the shooting?
Yes.
And what was that person's name?
Curtis Reeves.
All right. Did you later learn the name of the person that was shot?
I did.
And what was his name?
Chad Oulson.
All right. And we're just doing that just so it's easier to describe to the members of the jury who everyone is. When you first sat down in the theater, was the defendant Curtis Reeves there?
He was not.
Right. Did you see him at some point in time?
I caught him just as he was approaching my aisle, coming back from wherever he had been.
All right. Did you have an opportunity to watch him come up?
Briefly, yes.
All right. Is there anything about what you saw of him that led you to believe that he had difficulty walking?
Not that I noticed.
Okay. He didn't have a cane or a wheelchair or anything like
No.
that? Did he go by you?
He did.
All right. And did you watch him as he went down the row?
Only in the sense that I turned in that direction to move my knees out of the way so that he could get by. And of course, he was in my field of vision. I saw him go back to his seat.
Okay. Did you see him lean forward or do anything like that when he got to his seat?
Not really. I saw him take his seat. I didn't pay much attention at that time. I was just really kind of scanning the room.
Okay. And based on the lighting conditions, did you have any difficulty seeing him?
No.
All right. At some point in time after he returned to his seat, did you see any contact between him and Chad Oulson?
I did.
Okay. And what did you see at this point?
Just Mr. Reeves leaned forward. There was apparently an exchange.
Okay. And when you say exchange, could you hear exactly what was being said at that point in time during that exchange?
I could not.
Okay. You just know there was an exchange.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
At this point, did you notice whether or not Chad Oulson was standing or sitting?
He was standing.
While Chad Oulson was standing, did you hear him say anything?
I did, yes.
And what did you hear him say?
He said, do you mind? I got a message or a text from my babysitter. I'm checking on my daughter.
Could you hear the defendant say anything in response to that?
I could not.
After that response from Chad Oulson, what was the next thing you saw happen?
Well, something, I guess something was said. I saw a reaction from Chad Oulson where he reached across and grabbed popcorn from Mr. Reeves and flipped it back in his face.
Okay. And when you saw that happening, do you know where? Let me ask you this: do you know if anyone was with Chad Oulson at the time?
His wife. He was with his wife.
Okay. When Mr. Oulson reached over and grabbed the popcorn,
Yes.
did you see what his wife was doing?
I did not. Before the incident, all that I had seen was her hand go up to his chest, as if to coax him to sit down.
Okay. And do you recall if she was standing, sitting?
My recollection is that she was sitting.
And do you know how it was that she positioned her hand? Do you recall which way it was facing?
It was her left hand and on his left side of his chest.
Okay. And do you recall, let's say that if she was wearing a wedding ring, was the wedding ring facing Mr. Oulson or facing Mr. Reeves?
It would have been Mr. Reeves.
Okay. So her hand, I'm just using myself as a demonstrative aid, would be just this way facing.
Yes.
Okay. Now prior, well, let me skip ahead just for a moment. After you saw Mr. Oulson, you said, how did he throw the popcorn?
He reached across, grabbed the popcorn, and just kind of brought it back and then flipped it, kind of with the flip of the wrist back into the face of Mr. Reeves.
What happened right after that?
Well, I saw Mr. Reeves' arm come up from his side, extend. I saw a muzzle flash and heard the gunshot, and Mr. Oulson was shot.
Was that fairly quickly after the popcorn toss?
It was very, very quickly.
At any point in time, in this entire time that you're watching, do you ever see Mr. Oulson climbing over his row into the defendant's row?
No, sir.
Okay. And are you sitting in the defendant's row?
I'm in the defendant's row, that's correct.
Okay. And where is Mr. Oulson in relation to the defendant?
One row below.
Okay. And at any time did you see Mr. Oulson climbing into the defendant's row?
No, sir.
At any point in time, did you see, other than the popcorn flick, Mr. Oulson throw anything at the defendant?
I did not.
At any time did you see Mr. Oulson punch the defendant?
No, sir.
At any time did you see Mr. Oulson in a position where he's leaning over the chair as if to punch the defendant?
No, sir.
At any time did you hear the defendant exclaiming or yelling anything that would give you the impression he was being attacked?
I did not.
Okay. Did you get the impression from anything that the defendant was doing, physically or saying, that gave you the impression that he was in a life or death struggle?
No, sir.
So you're telling this jury the only thing you saw was Mr. Oulson flick popcorn?
Yes, that's correct.
At any time did you see the defendant grab his head as if he was injured or hurt in any manner?
No, sir, I didn't.
And that would be before the popcorn?
Correct. No, I didn't see anything.
And at any time did you see him act as though he had been injured?
No, sir.
Did you ever hear Mr. Oulson threatening the defendant?
I did not.
Did you ever see Mrs. Oulson standing in front of Chad Oulson trying to hold him back as if this raging guy was trying to get into the defendant's row?
No, sir.
After the shot, did you hear the defendant say anything?
Yes.
Okay, and what was it that you heard the defendant say?
Throw popcorn in my face.
After the shooting, did you see what the defendant did with the firearm?
He brought it back and appeared to lay it in his lap.
Okay. Did someone come up to him at some point in time and take the firearm from him?
Yes.
After Mr. Oulson was shot, did you see what happened to him?
He said, "I can't believe this," and he turned toward his row and took a step or step and a half and collapsed.
Okay. At some point in time, did you see Mrs. Oulson?
Yes.
Okay. And what was she doing when you saw her?
Well, she was hysterical, of course, and had began running up and down the aisle to where I was at, and my wife was behind me. She had been shot in the finger, and we tried to help her with that. We had some napkins and wrapped her finger up, and
Okay, so when you saw Miss Oulson, you saw her finger,
yes,
and what did it look like?
it looked like it was hanging on by the skin.
So you helped her at that point?
Tried to, yes.
All right. At some point in time, did deputies from the sheriff's office come to the theater?
Yes.
All right. Did you stay in the theater the entire time, meaning from the time of the shooting until the time deputies came into the theater, or did you do something else?
Well, I had, in an effort to help Mrs. Oulson, I had asked her if there was someone that I could call, and trying to catch up with her, we wound up down at the exit by the screen and stepped outside, and I asked her if I could call someone to help her if she wanted to check on her children or whatever, and she said yes and gave me her cell phone and told me who to call.
Okay. Did deputies eventually get to the theater?
Yes.
All right. At some point in time, were you given a form sometimes referred to as a written statement to fill out?
Yes. Well, actually, I had to go find it, but there was a gentleman in the room that people kind of migrated to get the form. It was pretty disorganized at that point.
Okay. Did anyone give you any instructions about how to fill it out, how much, how little, anything like that?
No, sir.
All right. So you just put in there the details you thought would be important.
Yes.
All right. Did you assume at some point you'd be interviewed by someone in law enforcement?
Yes,
Were you in fact interviewed by someone in law enforcement?
I was.
At any point in time, did you discuss all the details of what you saw with people that were in the theater that you did not know?
No.
Everything you're testifying to, is that what you personally heard
That's correct.
and personally what you observed?
Yes, sir.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
I don't have any further questions, thank you.
Thank you. Cross? Yeah. Lunch now, and we'll take an hour for lunch. I'll ask you to be back at about 1:45, and we'll resume at that point. All right? Remember my instructions during the recess.